Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our Annenberg Research Seminar. As we try to do every year, we have several of our own faculty members who give talks at the Annenberg Research Seminar, especially when important events or things that they've been working on have come to fruition. And we're delighted to have Professor Jonathan Aronson today to be talking about his new book. Since normally I introduce our visitors by telling you something about their background, I was thinking I would do that today, but then, you know, he's ours, and we all know that. So rather than my telling you, I thought I would give you a quiz. So, who can tell me where he did his undergraduate work? Anybody know?
Harvard.
Spoken
Same
like
era as our dean.
Yeah.
The dean was a year before me,
And was
but the same year as Marty Kaplan.
And how about what relative to the year you were there?
He's a child.
All right, so we know he did his undergraduate work at Harvard. Where did he get his PhD? Anybody know?
Juan, you should know this. This is the same place you did.
Oh, Stanford.
Stanford University. Excellent. All right. I was going to tell you that he has written 3 books prior to the one that he has here, a new one. But I just discovered talking to him that he has in fact written 8 books. So I won't ask any of you the name of it. Can anybody tell me the name of the school on campus that he was the director of for a number of years before coming to the Annenberg School? Okay.
International relations.
And how would you know?
Well, because I student there.
All right. Excellent. And what center did he direct for while he was here at the Annenberg School? Anybody know?
I don't know the exact name. I know the address.
Curl?
Annenberg Center. The Annenberg Center?
The Annenberg Center, sure. Jonathan has an honorary doctorate. Does anybody know where the honorary doctorate came from? I actually know this because I've seen his funny gown at graduation. Tom?
I think it's St. Petersburg.
St. Petersburg State University in Russia. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. He's also been on the in fact, is on the Council of Foreign Relations and the Pacific Council on International Affairs. One other thing I would mention is that he also directs a center here, or a program here at the Annenberg School, which is sponsoring this program today. Anybody know what the name of that group is? Come on.
The Annenberg Research Network on International Communication.
The Annenberg Research Network on International Communication. John is a teacher, faculty member, colleague, and an esteemed scholar, and we're delighted to have him talk about his book here. Jonathan?
Thank you.
Happy Columbus Day. You don't get any mail today. I wanted to start actually with 2 things that happened today, which to try and put into context some of the things that are I'm going to talk about. One, we had the Nobel Prize in Economics was named today for Elinor, Ostrom, and Ollie Williamson. And I'm not even going to ask you what they've done. It's sort of up here. But transaction cost, institutional analysis, sort of looking at the micro to understand how things work. And I'm delighted by this because it is an approach that I take very frequently in terms of that, of trying to figure out how institutions, industries work. And I think this is a well-deserved one. Everybody is sort of celebrating that finally we've had a woman win the Nobel Prize in Economics. I celebrate because the work's so good. And I think it is a well-deserved piece.
you were going to mention that Elinor Ostrom was a faculty member here at USC for many years.
Well, that too. That was before I was here, so I'm going to mention it last. The approach that I have taken in my work is a little different from what some others take here. I'm sort of what might be called an embedded theorist, which is I like theory, I celebrate theory, but I am specifically interested in how theory translates into the real world and how this really works. The work that this is drawn from comes from a book that Peter Cowhey and I came out with earlier this year. We have a deal, Peter and I, this is actually the fourth and fifth book that we've done together. We write the book together, and then he likes Washington more than I do, so he goes into the government and he tries to then implement what we have thought up. We did this before with the last book. We've done this again with this particular book. We are also believers that people should have access to this, and knowing what the royalty schedule is, we give it away. So anybody who would like the book, that's where you go. It's free. You can download it under the Creative Commons license. You can pass it around to anybody you want. And if any of this is interesting to you, feel free. It is free. Now, what is that I'm going to talk about today? Innovation. How one works this. How does one get institutions? I actually forgot the second thing I was going to say that happened today, which I don't think anybody knows. The new Japanese government this morning, and now actually it's tomorrow, announced that they are going to establish a new institution that is based on the structure of the Federal Communications Commission for the first time. So out of the ministry and into a separate institution. So people are looking at communication. Why are people looking so much at communication? Well, because it is a robust piece of the economy. It is one of those few places that people are hopeful that it can lead to innovation, can lead people to greater productivity at a time when we certainly need it. Now, the first point I'd like to make about this is we actually have seen a tremendous transformation of international communications rules, institutions, and the way it's handled in the last 20 years. And that it works. That we have made significant progress from an era when I was growing up where we had AT&T and a bunch of other monopolists who ran the system, who pretty much did what they wanted to do, who were in most countries owned and operated by the government, that were generally left to tell the regulators, if there were any regulators, what it was that they should do. That in the last 20 years, and 25 years really, since the breakup of AT&T, which happens in the early 80s but actually takes effect on January 1st, 1984, what we have seen is an increase in competition in all elements of the marketplace for communications, hardware, software, and communication services that is quite unprecedented. It's not just in the U.S. It's pretty much in every industrial country and in most developing countries as well. And that the reason for this was simply it provided tremendous opportunities. It was cheaper and it worked better. So that nobody followed the U.S. model exactly. Nobody ever follows the U.S. model exactly. But everybody watches what happens in the U.S. so that what happens in the U.S. is then filtered through the lens of each individual country or region, and you end up with developments that bounce off what the U.S. did And that has been extraordinarily important. So the communication system, as it is today, simply couldn't have existed. I'd actually go further, though I'm not going to push it this way, that without the breakup of AT&T, there wouldn't be an internet in the form we know it today. Because AT&T wasn't very interested in that, and had you not broken up AT&T in 1984, you would have had a much clunkier system. Remember, the AT&T was banned from doing internet kinds of stuff altogether before '84, and they really wouldn't have been very happy with these kinds of developments. So that, that's how big this really is. Second, we have seen in the 1990s major agreements among countries on how communications should be managed internationally. They didn't exist before. The WTO was an organization that dealt with goods. AT&T, in its infinite wisdom before 1984, did not believe that they were involved with trade. They had what they called jointly provided services. So they hand off a signal midway through, in the middle of the ocean, or in a transponder in a satellite. And I literally had arguments with these people going on and on, saying, but we're not involved with trade. We don't do anything international. We hand it off. AT&T, in its infinite wisdom, its first international sale, its first two international sales were quite interesting. The first sale it made was of equipment. It sold it to the Shah of Iran 3 months before he went down. The second major sale that they made was to Japan for an echo reducer for satellites. This came in, and it got to Japan, and it didn't work. It didn't work very well. The Japanese called up AT&T and said, we've got a problem. The stuff you sold us doesn't work. AT&T said, we'll send a team over to Tokyo immediately. The team goes out. A day later, the Japanese call back to AT&T and say, we're not suing you. Please bring your lawyers home and send us your engineers. Literally. The WTO agreement created a whole set of principles, norms, and rules for governing international communications outside of the ITU. The ITU was a wholly owned monopoly owned by other monopolies. So it was owned by the people who had created the old system, and the U.S. pushed, and this time quite well, to get the WTO to create a new set of rules. It actually helped the ITU as well. Since the WTO took an awful lot of their authority, the ITU finally started to wake up and do things. A third thing, actually one that Cowhey and I get at least a little bit of minor credit for, he more than I. The FCC benchmark. In the mid-1990s, the U.S. was unhappy about what was called accounting and settlement rates, which, unless you really like the esoterica, which I do, but most people don't, of the way the phone system billing works. What this was a system that caused a huge transfer from the United States to everybody else. There's only one country in the world at that time where we received more phone calls than we got. And we'll give a prize to anybody who figures it out. Finland. The reason for it is the Russians were sending all their stuff through Finland. So, but we tend to originate more traffic. We make more calls. The way the system worked, and it had gotten completely out of whack, the United States was running a $5 billion a year deficit on trade because, for really peculiar reasons, if you make an international phone call from the United States, that's called an import. I'm going to spare you, but it is. So essentially what the benchmarks were, the United States unilaterally said, this system is broken. We're not going to even negotiate. We're just going to fix it. We are going to mandate that phone calls that the settlement rates are going to drop over a period of time. And everybody yelled and screamed, and we actually, at Kirchhoff, had one of the critical meetings of this some years ago, where the Russians sent 3 people to beat up on us, and we said, we're still going to do it. It doesn't matter. The Australians, the Singaporeans, everybody complained about what the U.S. was doing, and then it worked. And it generated a huge jump in traffic. And they didn't lose any money, because even though phone calls came way, way down in how much it cost, the volume went up, the possibilities went up, the globalization went up so far that it created a whole new world that was possible. So the deficit of the U.S. dropped, the economic activity dropped, and this was a major thing. Now, one of the things that this all did was it did not make everything perfect. So a few of you have heard me talk about this before. The policies that were put into place had lots of holes. Any good economist could tell you why it couldn't, shouldn't, wouldn't, didn't work very well, that why it could have been done better. Our point of view was quite different, which is we are believers in pretty good policy. It doesn't have to be perfect. There's a phrase, Jeff will know it, don't let perfect become the enemy of the possible, or something of the good. We're very much in that. This is now being bandied about on health care, where we probably will get a health care bill. It's not going to be something that anybody likes everything in it. But for the first time in 7 administrations, it looks like something's going to get pushed, and it is a step, at least, in the right direction. We're very much in that kind of view, because if you can get it moving in the right direction, you can always fix it later. You will make mistakes. All of you are, of course, perfect, but the rest of us have some problems in terms of this. We believe that there is a real possibility now of doing some other really good things in the internet. One of the things about the rules, the laws, the regulations, the principles that were established during the 1980s and 1990s is the internet wasn't there. They do not cover the internet. The internet is largely outside the boundaries of any regulators. So that what we're interested in is what ought it to look like? What kinds of principles, norms, rules would you like to have? And those are not easy questions. We had a meeting 3 weeks ago over at Kirchhoff where we brought in a bunch of government and corporate types with some academics and said, if you were going to create a system for APEC, the Asian area, what would you have it look like? We would like the internet to stay robust, because some of those same old companies that stopped or slowed growth before are trying to get control of the internet now. So that we are not believers in micro-regulation. We do not want the government to run everything. But we think that it is possible and desirable for governments to play an important positive role. And part of the issue is, how do you figure out what they should be doing and what they shouldn't be doing? Because there are a whole lot of things you really wouldn't want these people messing around with at all. But there are a few things that we can, if we can get the policy right, we create a framework that will lead to innovation and growth. If we don't get it right, it is not that the whole thing is going to collapse or we're going to have the world calamity. It is much more that it's going to underperform. It's going to get clunkier and clunkier. It's sort of every time you put on, if all of these software innovations are so wonderful, how come your computer keeps getting slower and slower? It's that you're trying to develop. We think that right now we are at a specific important time, and that there is a possibility that the system is ripe for change. Now, ripe for change doesn't mean it's going to happen this week or next week, but that it could happen in the next several years. And that what we believe is that there are a number of reasons this is true and that it is important. We think that ICT, information communications, telecommunications, fuels global growth. One of the most positive aspects of the economy. Other than figuring out what to do with all the old computers and screens, which become a problem, this is a major growth area for the United States. This is a major area for exports and positive aspects. And when what you're competing with, what's the biggest U.S. exports right now? Among them, trash. We're really good at sending trash. We get things from Asia and Europe, and we send back literally trash because other companies will take it. Internet, wireless, broadband, all of these things that are being talked about in the FCC are change agents. What we are also seeing are technology innovations, particularly modularity, and things are getting cheaper that are changing business models. So other than the music and the movie industries, most businesses are at a point that they say, we cannot continue to operate the way that we have always done so in the past. We have to think through, given the new environment, what ought we be doing? How do we make money? So that this becomes very important. So here are some challenges. How do you promote a productive shift in the direction of a world market? We think that most of the real benefits that came from the regulatory changes after '84 and during the 1990s have largely been milked from the system. That you need to unleash new things, that the innovation level from communications is slowing. And much more efficient today. And can you find a domestic and global governance of the ICT ICT infrastructure that adapts to seize the structure? So what the book is about is arguing, the first half of it essentially says, this is why we think things have changed and why there is an opportunity. We throw in a theory chapter which says this is sort of where we come from. And we have 3 case studies about different aspects that say this is how the political economy of these groups work in terms of trade, in terms of the internet, in terms of spectrum, in terms of all of those good things. What should we, and finally we make some specific suggestions about what needs to be done. The foundations of this inflection point. I need to say just a word or two about it. One is we are moving towards a modular architecture. What is happening on hardware, on software, on services? What you want is something like Lego blocks. Everything has the opportunity to fit together. If somebody somewhere comes up with a better equipment, a better piece of software, a better game, you want it to be able to be plugged into the system. You don't want it to be blocked. So like a Lego block, they can come in all sorts of colors and shapes, but they all fit together because the interface, the interoperability, if you like, is there. So that what you want in a system ultimately is something where good ideas are enabled by the underlying rules and infrastructure. So that if somebody comes, shouldn't matter where they come from. It shouldn't matter if they come from a big company or a small company. They should be allowed to happen. And we see lots of evidence. And we go through this in great detail. about that this is in fact the trend that we are developing. A second thing that is happening, we've all heard about, oh, look, the price of semiconductors is coming down. We argue that the cheap revolution, something that was actually coined in Forbes in the early 2000s by Rich Kargard, is well underway. Microelectronics is the piece that usually gets it. But what we're seeing is a movement towards ubiquitous broadband, software, digital content, all have gotten a lot cheaper. Here are some of your lines. What you're seeing is just tremendous change in the performance per dollar that you get across the industry. Note particularly areas like fiber optics and storage that are improving in efficiency much faster than mere PCs. And that what you're getting as a result of this is a tremendous shift in possibilities. Silicon chips. Number of transistors still doubling every 18 months, the famous Moore's Law. Data storage. The bits per square inch is still doubling every 12 months. Optical fiber. The bits per second is doubling every 9 months. We need this, by the way, with the streaming, because we are getting to a world that everybody basically wants to have anything on demand. You are your personal network platform. We are now getting households that are using as much broadband as small companies used to do, 3 years ago? Our friend here, wave your hand. She's trying to make sure that we still stay connected, right?
I'm trying.
At this university. It is a challenge. It has shifted. Does anybody use and it's shifting every few months. It's not every few years. How many of you have a wireline phone? Students. Who owns a wireline phone? What's wrong with you? Everybody else is carrying their wireless phone. That has huge implications of what we are doing. Some implications. It's harder, if you really can get to modularity, to be anti-competitive. So that one of the things that governments and markets should both be celebrating is you want modularity. You want to be able to pick what it is you want to do. Now, of course, everybody's going to try and keep you locked in as long as they can. So if you go and get your wireless phone, they'll say, oh, we'll give you a great deal on the phone, but you got to sign a 2-year contract. What you'd really like is something akin to what Japan did long ago on international, is you'd like to, when you make a phone call, you'd like the phone to automatically choose which is the cheapest provider in making the call. You shouldn't have to do that. It should automatically be there. Or you could do it if you're sending data and you really need a high reliability rate. You could say, I'll buy the higher quality in order to make sure the data gets through. An example in terms of different systems need different places. We have something called SWIFT, which tracks your airline baggages. And it is a perfectly delightful system. It will tell you where your bags are, but it has a very high error rate. Because they found out that if 1 in 100 bags get lost somewhere, it's a bother, but it's not enough of a bother for them to pay all the money to upgrade the system. I'm sorry, that's CETA, not SWIFT. Is the airline one. SWIFT is the banking systems one. SWIFT works a different way. They make bank transfers, millions and millions of dollars. People get very, very upset if their $1 million bank transfer or their $5 million bank transfer gets lost. It's the highest grade system you can get in terms of this, so that you pay for and get different things. The pricing on some of this is going to be totally surprising. What do you give away? You have Chris Anderson saying everything's going to be free. Well, no, it's not. But what you're going to get is people expect. My kids expect to be able to download anything they want, voice audio, voice images, movies, anywhere they happen to be, and they don't think they should have to pay very much for it. Is that about right? Our students?
They want to pay zero for it.
They want to pay zero for it. You can't do it at zero, but you've got to figure out some way for this all to work. And the service applications increasingly don't respect any boundaries. Susan and I were talking a little bit beforehand about the cloud. How do you regulate the cloud? It's everywhere. What are implications for things like personal privacy? It's going to be lots of fun, as we are seeing. What happens when you get some really cool new applications? Anybody following the shoe companies? Nike and all of those, what are they doing now? They will put sensors in your shoes that will tell you how much you are running around. We increasingly are getting it for health care. Tell you if you're healthy or not. We're to the point pretty close that we can put something inside of you that says, oops, your cholesterol's too high. Don't eat that. Or go to the hospital now. You're about to have a heart attack. But they know all sorts of. Who owns that? Let's just take the simple example of Nike. If you decide to go from Nike to Adidas, which also has the same system, who owns the data? Can you transfer your Nike data to your Adidas shoes? Big questions. It's a debates akin to what we used to have with number portability, which for years all the phone companies said, we own the phone numbers. And it took a major effort to get people to change and say, no, individuals own their own phone numbers. We'd like to see some light touch regulation. We use this term intentionally. We're in talks with Julius Janikowski and the FCC. This is a book that we have no idea how many people have read it because we give it away. We do know that Julius Janikowski, the head of the FCC, carries it around with him, and we've had 3 meetings with his senior staff about the implications of this. So we have an elite readership, but not a wide readership. You'll have a hard time finding it in Borders. But what we're looking for is ways to have user cooperatives share the cost of investing, spectrum issues, all of these sorts of things. What kinds of light touch regulation do we ideally want? What do we want to see? And how do we get there? Some questions remaining. If you have an emerging personal network platform that I have been referring to, how do you deal with that? A government or regulatory privacy. How do you deal with audiovisual? I haven't talked about that very much. But the big shift is everybody wants to carry around their streaming media. I was in the Apple store yesterday with my son. I know all about the policy, but I don't know anything about the technology. And there's a new iTelephone, where you sort of plug it in and it makes your iTelephone. I don't know. You plug it into your computer, and it makes the computer automatically into a TiVo. So you can TiVo your shows with this little $150 device, and it will download there. You can also download an app on your iPhone, and you can get for no additional cost, you can get that same streaming feed onto your phone. So you can watch Fringe or whatever TV show you happen to be addicted to on your phone while you're going to the football game or whatever. Now, those are the big issues. Those are the big questions. In terms of innovation, in terms of the truly big picture, I have kept this You know, I have actually, and I think I'm not going to show it, some, you know, the really big questions in terms of survival, getting the economy going, sustainability. But the nice thing about ICT is that if you can get it right, it is not an answer to, you know, resource use, collapse of civilizations, global extinction of human beings, and, you know, other good things like that. But what it does do is it provides an opportunity that is pretty well agreed upon to promote productivity, innovation, and communications. Now, the last part of the book, which I will leave to you, but I will tell you what page to go to. If you go to page 265, now you have an incentive to download it. What we actually try and lay out, and we brought in one other colleague who had been, both Cowhey and this other fellow had run the International Bureau of the FCC. So we were sort of the ones who did it the last time, or they did. I sort of sat on the sideline and cheered on. How do you go about it? And why, going back to the Nobel Prize in Economics today, it's so important. It's not easy. There are ways of doing it. One of the things we were talking about in the faculty meeting today is how do we get more training at Annenberg and elsewhere that will help our students say, how do you begin to implement policy? How do you begin to identify policies that are really important? That we can aim to get something to actually put in place. The first piece is you've got to get principles. What are the big principles that you are trying to persuade people of? And until you have some general agreement on the principles, both nationally and internationally, it's real hard to go much further. Second are and some of the ideas, I'll give you some of the principles just for the fun of it. Some of the principles that we talk about are, you want to enable modularity, enable transactions among modular ICT building blocks. That's what we think that the government should be focusing on, just making sure things are interoperable. Facilitate interconnection of modular capabilities. Facilitate supply chain efficiencies and reduce transaction costs. That goes back to Williamson. Reform domestically to help reorganize global governance. That if you can get these basic ideas, don't try and worry about price too much. The government can't figure out what something ought to cost on this. But you can do some other things. Some basic norms. Delegate flexibly. Don't get locked into a box about how to do it, and a whole bunch of others. Once you can begin to persuade, and it takes some time, it takes lots of meetings, sitting down with people and say, well, what do you think? It takes a lot of listening. At that point, you begin to figure out what would the rules look like? What kinds of regulations, domestic and international, ought there to be? And I go back to the point I made earlier, which is we have had tremendous success in the area of communications in enabling the system. That success is not endless and needs to be constantly rejuvenated. And that is the challenge that we are now facing, both in the FCC but internationally as well, of how do we make sure that competition, interoperability, interconnection is maintained. And if we focus on if governments should focus on making sure that those things happen, and that means bringing in the competition bureaus or the antitrust bureau and the Justice Department heavily into this, we've got a real shot at least getting out of the current downturn. And this is one of those tools that's going to help. Why don't we stop there and leave some time for questions?
Okay, great. Tom.
Thanks, Jonathan. I thought it was really interesting. My question has to do with the concept of
global governance? Because it seems to me that a lot of the systems that provide global governance so favor the elites, industry elites, financial elites, government elites, who reinforce each other through campaign contribution. How do you get citizen voices to the table in this discussion so that the debates take place in somewhat different fashion?
I'll give you two anecdotal answers to that. One was years ago, before he took over the WTO and was running instead trade for the EU. I was in a meeting with Pascal Lamy, and the question that I frequently will ask is, what surprised you most about your job? And the answer he gave was, I had no idea that I would have to spend so much time with NGOs. I spend 35 to 40% of my time having to listen to all of these people about, and he was not happy about this, with their issues. But what had happened is it seeps up more that way than by sitting at the table. The other is the WSIS, story about the WSIS in Tunisia, which was sort of happened by accident, actually. There was only supposed to be one, but a promise had been made to the president of Tunisia that we'd have a second one, so we held the second one. I downloaded the list of groups that were officially represented at the WSIS process in Tunisia a few years ago. The list of groups, not the individual members, but the list of groups was 325 pages single-spaced. If you have that many people in the room, I don't care what it is, you can't order lunch. There is no way to possibly do anything. That the result is you need some seat. It's happening, but it doesn't happen in the way that those who say, well, we should have a seat at the table. If you put everybody at the table, absolutely nothing will happen. And it's a constant balancing act is the answer. It's happening. People are listening. Part of it is if you succeed, you get people look at it. People are looking more for best practices. So not a perfect answer, but it pushes. There's a push and pull in both ways.
One of the reasons I have a landline is because I won't do Time Warner Cable, and the only other option I have is AT&T. Mm-hmm. I had to get a landline to get the internet. Yep. And that points to the problem and the concern and the debate that's going on with net neutrality is, because of the way that these companies have been able to control the market, you only have one or two options to access the internet. And so really the issue is at the access point. What kind of policy has already been put in place? This is similar to the example you gave of AT&T.
That's the big fight that's going on. You're right. What the goal is to make three. One of the biggest mistakes that was made in the previous FCC is when AT&T was broken up into the regional bells before it sort of recombined. What you did, they gave wireless licenses to each of them in their own area. Well, if you have a wired and wireless in the same area, the likelihood you're really going to compete very hard isn't very great. So what they ought to have done is said, okay, you can have a wireless license if you want to, but it can't be in the area that you're providing wireline communications. There were simpler answers of doing all of this. And it goes back to the pretty good policy point. We made a lot of mistakes. A lot of things that were done in terms of this didn't work out as they should have. That's one of them. And it's hard because you'd like a system that you could change more often, but the politics of it is difficult.
Well, how do we encourage more competition?
Well, having both, having what you ideally like is wireline, wireless, and cable provider in as many areas as possible. If you had those three, it would be a pretty good start. If you then want to let DWP also provide those services, which they could, by the way, because they have both the billing systems and the links to your house, then you get a fourth. That's happened a fair amount in France.
Regarding global governance, I'd like to hear your assessment on the current efforts to develop a framework for internet governance at the global level, like the Internet Governance Forum. And I agree, is in your response to Professor Holohan, having too many actors at the table can be problematic. But is that also necessary to develop these common norms and values, which can then translate into policy principles? And is it possible to develop this global framework for internet governance?
Ultimately, that's why listening gets real important. That's why, the more the merrier in terms of people saying what they want. In the end of the day, there are going to be 10 to 12 countries, institutions at the table in terms of this. What is really different is that you're seeing the BRICS are now part of that. We've moved from the G8 to the G20 as the operative group in terms of this, and it's a slightly different mix of countries on different issues. So in terms of how it works, it's not going to go to 1,000 people. It's just not 150 countries. It's not going to happen. They don't have the expertise very often. But Brazil, Russia, India, China, and Indonesia is now making a play to be included, are going to be on the table on a lot of those.
But those who aren't at the table throw the bricks through the windows and protest, right?
Yeah, but ultimately, what happens, go back to what I was talking about before in terms of the benchmark. The benchmark, there was a discussion about whether or not it could be done on an international. And the decision was made at the FCC and in the U.S. government that it was the right thing to do, that we ought to lower international phone rates, and that nobody else in the world thought this was a good idea because the U.S. was sending lots of dollars to them. Every developing country in the world, sometimes directly to Swiss bank accounts of African countries, of the ministers. It was a completely corrupt system, and that if you tried to do it through a negotiation, it would fail. So the U.S. simply said, they did it in a tricky way. What they said is they couldn't tell the foreign countries what they could or could not do. So they told AT&T and MCI, we will sue you if you pay more than this much on settlements rates to these countries. So the object was AT&T. Now, that was perfectly happy with AT&T and MCI at that point, because what they said is, okay, now we can tell everybody else, sorry, we can't pay any more than this. That's the rules. Like it or lump it. The reaction was, everybody screamed bloody murder for about 3 months, and then discovered that it worked, and that it was a positive thing, and the screaming all stopped.
I have a question, if you could hone in on when you were talking about who owns the cloud and the tension between in Silicon Valley there's they embrace their open source identity. Google wants to save the world, but to a point. And so if you could kind of focus on the obstacles that you see, what some people have called a knowledge ecology movement. His name is Duke Law, but kind of those tensions between a knowledge ecology and a privatizing knowledge, almost open source or commercializing knowledge.
There are risks and dangers in all of this. If you look at cybersecurity issues, at issues of privacy, of issues of spam, and efforts to deal with it, at corruption and criminality and national security issues, all of that comes in, which is why I think this is going to be an incredibly difficult problem to deal with. They don't talk, the Obama administration likes to talk, we are open and transparent. But you haven't heard about what they're doing on cybersecurity, which is a pretty much full-time endeavor within the administration at the same time, because they're really, really concerned with it. It is so, the danger with the cloud is you've got to get some of these aspects right, because you don't want people knowing your knowledge, knowing everything about you. I am fond of telling, excuse if a few of you have heard this story, I'm friendly with a guy named the Incredible Randy. You know the Incredible Randy? Incredible Randy is a magician and a debunker of ESP. And he was the one who he keeps getting sued by Uri Geller because he keeps proving Uri Geller can't bend spoons. Well, actually, Uri Geller can bend spoons, but any magician can bend spoons. So that what happens with ESP, with all of these people, is the people with ESP come in, and scientists say, "My God, they can do amazing things." Well, the problem, what Randy did was he said, any magician can do this better. The scientists are dupes. And he's offered for years a prize to anybody who can demonstrate any form of ESP, and he'll give him $1 million. The only catch is he gets to design the experiment. And they've done this on television. They've had specials on it. Nobody has ever come close to showing any ESP at all. So given that, he did some investigation, which leads to your question, of one of the Psychic Friends networks. Remember them? And one of the well-known psychics in New York City, who had amazing results in terms of psychic. He was getting lots of money. And he was asked, I think by the city of New York, to figure out how was he doing it. Were they really psychics, these people off the street? It turned out they were highly technologically sophisticated. Most people call psychic networks from their home phones. We can get what number that is. I don't know what it is today, but when he looked at this a few years ago, from the time you called up, they got the number you were calling from, to the time they were into your credit records was about 11 seconds. And you see something like, oh, there's a lift ticket there for Big Bear. And 2 days later, there's a bill for an orthopedic surgeon. I see white. I see snow. I see a terrible accident for you or somebody near to you. Oh, you're amazing! I'm afraid I've just debunked the Psychic Friends Network. Or at least on the high end. One more question?
It sounds like the U.S. deregulation in the 80s provided a good model for other countries.
Yep.
And I wonder if there are models that exist now that are being used to guide the types of policy decisions we've been talking about.
Well, people, there's a lot more discussion. One of the things that happens among communications regulators is they quite routinely go back and forth talking about, well, we're thinking about this, what do you think? Or we're doing it this way, well, how are you doing it? So that what's emerging is an effort at best practices in terms of these things. It's not perfect. It works better with industrial countries and some of the larger developing countries. But I'm going down to Brazil in a month because the Brazilian president's office has decided that they need to think about broadband. So about half a dozen of us are going to go down and say, how should we think about broadband in a Brazilian context, which, of course, having won the Olympics in 2016, will be even more on their minds, because they're not going to want to be embarrassed by having a faulty, non-working system in 2016, and they have just about the right amount of time to get this thing working. Better Chicago than having your broadband fail in Rio. So, there's a lot of talk under the radar that goes on. What isn't happening, quite frankly, and sort of one of the missions I have here, is there's not enough really sound academic analysis coming out of communication schools about what ought to be done. And unless you've got the economic analysis and some of the economic background, along ideally with some law, you're not going to be listened to. So it's really important to get some of those analytical tools associated with law and economics, because the people who are running this are largely communications lawyers and communications economists. And they've been quite successful. And this is happening worldwide.
Okay, well, it's 1 o'clock. Time for us to draw a line under it. Our speaker next week is Jeremy Bailenson from Stanford University. He's going to be talking on the virtual self and describing his research on Annenberg. So do come and join us next week. And would you put your hands together with me?
Thank you.